We're continuing our series. It always brings me joy to see Jude at the front operating a phone. It reminded me that our last holiday to Cornwall, she had all the family in the sea for a good while, and we were under the impression that we were the recipients of photographs, and then when we got back later at night, we realized that Jude had taken about 30 selfies, you know, that way, when you think you're taking pictures of everybody else. But it was really sweet to see the joy in her face that our family brought to her in that moment. We're going to play you a clip right now, as you do, so just get very comfortable. This is, you might recognize the film. To some of you, this film will be, and it is to me and my son in the back, it's a joyous film for us to watch. It's the classic noughties comedy horror, Shaun of the Dead. So just let this movie clip consume you.
Do you want anything from the shop?
Cornetto.
I think that's enough. I hope that brought you a little bit of joy. The gag is, in that scene, there's a couple of scenes where Shaun of the Dead walks to the shop. And in this scene, as the film progresses, people everywhere are turning into zombies. And Shaun of the Dead sleepwalks, zombie-like, to the shop. And there is an apocalyptic horror scene around him, and he doesn't even notice. And in a sense, the joke's on him. The joke is that he's a bigger zombie than actually the real-life zombies, but it's making a really clever point. It's funny, this clip, but it's also making a statement. There's a sense in which it pokes fun at everybody. It pokes fun at all of us. That's really what it's doing. We can all be walking around like we are zombies, and we don't even know. That is what the film suggests. In the last few weeks, I've been on jury duty, and apologies, I've bored those of you who know me well, I've bored you with stories of this. And I've been catching the train, my commute to Leeds Crown Court for the last 3 weeks, and that's been my story. It's been a new life for me. And on the first day, Jude texted me to ask me how it was going, and really cynically, I said on the first day, it's great. This is on my way in on the train. It's great, but everybody is like zombies, is what I said. And then, receiving a similar text a few weeks later, I realized, as I looked around and looked at my habits, I realized that I had joined the zombies, and I was now a zombie myself. And there was this moment, I don't know if you've ever had this on the way to work, or the way on your regular commute anywhere, when I got to the courthouse in Leeds, and I looked, did you ever have that moment where you look back and you think, I've got no concept at all of what has just happened? I could have been sat opposite Eric Cantona on the train. There could have been this gorgeous sunrise, and I had no sense of it. I just happened to be there. I was kind of sleepwalking my way there. And I think sleepwalking, to carry the analogy on, happens to us in life. And I kind of wonder how much of life is it possible for us to sleepwalk through? We can sleepwalk through a week at work, can't we? It can just go past us and we can kind of not notice anything that's there. We could sleepwalk through a career. We could sleepwalk through a relationship. We can become zombies pretty easily. I don't know if you can remember from last week, but we are reminded that Jonah is like a satirical punch for stubborn, narrow-minded religious people. So their flaws are exposed. You remember we talked about that, and there is opportunity for them to change. Jonah is the recipient of the punch in this sense, but it's there for us to see. Jonah is God's representative. He's got this critical message everything in this story that we've had read out by Marissa for us is screaming him into action, making him awake. If anybody should be awake in this moment, it should be him. He's God's man. He's God's rep. He's got the critical message. It's all about him. He's like, it's mission impossible, but he's the man on the mission. If anyone should be switched on, it's him. And yet, here's kind of the punch. Did you notice in the text as it was read out? For the most part, he's literally asleep. This is the satirical punch that the storyteller is giving us. And when he's not physically asleep, he may as well be asleep. One of the biggest messages that the Bible has for us, for whoever is listening anyway, whoever's picking up the Bible and reading it, not least us or his people, is this. And it says it at every different stage of the Bible, it's this kind of message. Wake up. You are sleepwalking through life, Israel. You are sleepwalking through life, church. You are sleepwalking through life, Abraham. You are sleepwalking through life. Wake up is the message in the Bible. And I just thought that's really interesting because one of the big messages that humanity sends back to whoever is up there listening is that we are awake. If there is a collective expression that our world is making at the moment to any aliens or any gods listening in, it is, we are awake, we have woken up, we are enlightened. So here's the question. On our way into week 2 of Jonah, just to get you thinking, see where you're at. Does the world look awake to you? Does it look like we are completely enlightened and we've got everything together? Does it look like we've woken up? Does your Christianity, this is a cutting question, so I wrote it down. Sometimes I write stuff down, I think that's a really good line, and then it just cuts me in two when I realize I've got to preach it. Does your Christianity feel awake? Do you feel like you're awake, or do you feel like you might need to really listen to this story of Jonah because it's actually a good story for you? Do you think that the church is awake? These are the questions that I want maybe to go through our minds and float around in our minds. And the sermon splits into 3 parts. Asks sort of 3 questions, gets us to think about 3 things. What is it possible for religious people, God's people, to sleep through? What kind of racket can we sleep through? How zombie-like can we get? And it gets us to think about whether we might be the zombies or not. It's a tricky one, but it's satirical, so it's going to hit us a little bit. What are we asleep to in our faith? Are we awake? Could we waken up? Is this message for me? What can God's people sleep through? What has the church slept through? What can't we sleep through? That's the second question. What is it impossible for human beings to sleep through? And what does being awake look like? So we'll cover those 3 things as we make our way through. You'll have in your head an idea of how the story of Jonah goes. You'll have in your head an idea of the ship on the sea, Jonah getting thrown in. You'll have an idea of all the mechanics and what that looks like. And what I'm going to try and do in terms of the story, and it'd be helpful if you can have the text up maybe just in this moment just to see that, is I'll try and describe it to you as the storyteller tells it. So the storyteller, the way that the story is told, this historical story, has different flavors to it and different nuances to it and different emphases to it. So I'm going to try and add some of those emphases. So there you can see, first of all, in verse 4, really interesting, God sent a great wind on the sea. The way that we interpret that is this idea of God hurling a storm onto the sea, like you would throw a football or you would throw a spear. This is just this sense of God going in a what looks like a violent fashion, certainly a powerful fashion. He throws this storm onto the sea. That's the image that we're supposed to get. And especially this week, I think, thinking about what's happened across our world this week, if we are awake, if we are conscious beings, if we are thinking Christians, which we should, I would encourage us to be thinking Christians, we should have a few questions here about storms, about God and storms. If the Bible is the answer to those questions, here's what we've got. We can't say, so you might have a question for the podcast after about this, you might have a stern word with me. Hopefully I've got this right. This is how I see it as I read the Bible and as I understand the Bible. We can't say, as I understand the Bible, that God is responsible for all of the storms. We can't pin it all on him. And that's a deeper conversation about free will, the curse of sin, and those kinds of things. But it's maybe a conversation to have, maybe even in the podcast. We can't say that God is responsible for every storm that comes our way, nor can we say nor can we easily rule out his involvement in any of the storms that we see, literal storms that we see or metaphorical storms that we see. Because the Bible would tell us often God is in the middle of the storm. You'll have read through stories about Jesus where God is in the middle of the storm, and the storm that we don't want to come across is actually brilliant because it's where he is found. Often we see that God is in control of the storm and God is being learnt. But sometimes, with these violent storms, God is sending the storms, metaphorical or physical, and he is, in a sense, awakening people. Everything about this storm in this story screams, as the storyteller tells it, and as the people in the story experience it, it screams that it's a God story. And it says, wake up. So do you see there in verse 4? The sea is, as it's described, it's really similar to Genesis 1 in creation. And that is a powerful moment in the story of the Bible. That is God acting with great power. That is a terrifying thing to behold. Creation's not a gentle thing. And the sea that we see in this story is reminiscent of that. God's Spirit is on the water. It's the same sort of language that is in creation. Verse 5, we see that the sailors are terrified. And they all are crying out to their gods. Everything about this storm has got the ring of God in it, even to the extent, and this is a bit of a slightly comedic moment in verse 4, where the ship suggests that he's scared and he's hanging on for dear life. It kind of comes to life, and the ship sort of says to us as part of the story, I can't hold it together anymore. And we see, despite all of that, in a really odd way, in an incredible way, that Jonah is somehow, even in this chaos, even in this clear moment of God action, Jonah is asleep. Jonah has fallen asleep, and the captain comes and runs into his ear, and he screams at him, I think, or he shouts at him. I don't know how polite a tap on the shoulder it is, and he says, "How can you sleep now?" God is clearly in this moment. How can you be asleep in this moment? The captain's question here, I don't think it's just a question about sleep. I don't think it's just a practical question. I think it's a storyteller moment. He's got his eye on the Hebrew campfires. He's got his eye on religious people, anyone who are asleep to their narrow-mindedness and judgmentalism. Jonah is God's man. He's got God's message. If anybody is going to be awake in this storm, in this moment, it's going to be him. He's even got the words or the thoughts that can save them. And yet, and the story makes a really big deal of it, it's really clever, he's asleep. Do you see the way that the story tells us? The story slips it into the narrative. The storyteller slips it into the narrative. He goes down, 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 down to sleep. He's out of it. Verse 5, second part of verse 5. He's gone, and this is not a thing, and this is probably another example of where a 45-year-old uses the wrong word, but he's gone what I'm going to call prime zombie. He's gone that way. He's just missing out on the moment completely. That's what the storyteller is drawing us to. And then he asks the question, it sort of hovers the question over us, how can there be a situation where people in the world need to hear God so badly when his message is so pressing, when his words can offer so much help, when the answers are all there? How can there be a situation like that and yet God's people be asleep? And do you see the kind of buttons that it pushes for religious people or Christian people? And by the way, I need to tell you, this is not the people that are in need of help here. This is not evil people in Nineveh. It's not asking us to think about that. These are people who've been good to him, who've tried to help him, who he can save. Yet he's asleep, and he's not going to even cry out. Do you notice that in the text? He won't even cry out to God for them. Here's the first sort of thing I want us to think about. We've got this big mission of Christianity in front of us. Just for a second, just forget So I hope this is not blasphemous. Just forget the big mission in that sense. Forget the calling to Nineveh. Forget the calling of Jesus to go out into to witness to the whole world. Just think about your little world and the people round about you. Our faith can fall asleep. I think this is one of the things that the text sort of shows us, and it's kind of a cutting thing. Our faith can be asleep to the needs of just those people round about us. It's a satirical punch. We can have this amazing story in our hearts. We can have this hope that changes our whole life around, and that can be there, and it can be a reality. And at the same time as it's a reality for us, we can be like Jonah, and we can just snooze our way through moments in life where we can be such a help. It causes us, I think, to think about how we share our faith and how we witness to others. And I'm going to go really carefully here, because one of the things I'm really conscious of is that religion, Christendom, has pushed the need for us to evangelize so hard, I think it's become like a bit of a guilt trip. And when it reaches the point that it's a guilt trip, have you felt that? Have you felt the church put that on you? Have you felt your faith put that on you? In a sense, it's good. We've got a great message, but equally, sometimes it can turn it into a false thing. We just think we've got to do it. It can lose its authenticity and not be real anymore. So I go here really gently. And yet at the same time, I'm compelled and I'm really moved by the story that causes me to wake up and remind me that I can snooze my way through not just church, not just my Christian week, but my whole life. And I can snooze my way through it with this message that is life-changing, even to the people that are around about me. It causes us to think that is a possibility for us. You've got the words of eternal life. You've got hope to pull people out of the storms. You've got people who you love in your workplace or in your homes who might well be sinking, who are really struggling. And often, we'll do anything we can think of to help them, but mention Jesus. And the story cleverly leaves that thought just hanging over us. The story goes on, verse 7. The sailors cast lots to see who the person that's brought the bad luck on board is, because that's what sailors do, isn't it? And of course, in this story, as is everything else that will happen in this story, Jonah is this comedic person to whom all the blame lies. He's the butt of all the jokes, he's where all the blame lies. So of course, it's Jonah. And then in verse 8, they start to ask questions. And when I first read through these questions, I thought these are quite gentle questions for butch sailors to be asking. They're kind of like dinner party or chat up sort of questions that you would ask. They sound more like that than crisis chat to me. It's an interesting first question, isn't it? You see that in verse 8? What do you do? You think that's where is that where you'd start if your boat was potentially sinking? I'm just wondering, what's your occupation? I'm just curious what that is. Where are you? Just tell me a little bit about where you're from. I think probably I'm half just trying to engage us all with the story when I say that, because I think the tone is probably a little bit more pressing than that. Every sailor that you hear about or that you know are pretty suspect about people that bring bad luck on board. And what's happening with the sailors here is that a seed of doubt is forming in their minds. I think the tone would come a little bit more pressing. There would be a little bit more pushy with their inquisition. Who are you? What's your story? And probably really pertinently, I think this is what they're driving at in these questions. What God have you upset? What have you done to bring this on us? And then verse 9 and 10 is the biggest penny drop moment of the story. This is the moment where these sailors realize that they've made, and this is a pun, a titanic naval boo-boo. Do you get that? This is where they look at it and go, oh man, we have messed this up. We have messed this up so bad, because Jonah says to them, my God, do you see how the fear that's going to be in them when they look around them and see the storm that's happening? My God is the God. He's the God of everything. And he's the God of the land, and wait for it, and the sailors are shaking in their boots as he says it when they realized who they've let on board, and the sea. And then he casually drops in as almost to make them fall on the floor. I told you this. When I got on board, do you see it there? I think it's in verse 10, maybe it's just after this. I told you I was running away from him. And the sailors realize what they've done, and they realize the mess that they are in, and they realize the problem that they're dealing with and the God that they're dealing with. And then the story, I just think this story is so fascinating. It's really amazing. Because this is the point where you look at the story and you go to yourselves, this is where they're going to go savage, these sailors. This is the point where they're going to butcher him. This is the point where they're going to beat up on him. This is the point where anything goes when you're on a ship. Nobody knows what's going to happen. That's what you're thinking. And yet, in this story, do you see what the sailors do? The pagans, the one that, as the storyteller tells it, you wouldn't expect to do anything good. Jonah should be the one doing the good things. He's God's man. He's the Hebrew. He should be the good thing. That's what the people listening to the story are expecting. But these people turn out to be good. You could even say, as you see the text unfolding, that they're God-fearing. They start screaming out God in fear. They're more Jew than Jonah. In verse 10, can you see? They're terrified. But it's not just fear of the storm. They've started to be scared of this God. They've got like this reverential fear that they've learned about who God is. And then verse 13, and this is really beautiful, and it's really pointed as we receive it as hearing this story. Even though their lives are in peril on this storm, they do everything that they can to save Jonah. The pagans do this. The sailors, the people that we should expect little from, at least in this story, they try to row him back. And even when he says, just chuck me in, they don't do it. They are the good people in this story. They're like the good Samaritans. They're like people on a noble mission, like Jonah should have been. And then most incredibly, right at the end, and I don't know if you noticed this, it's like subtly displayed in the text, Jonah doesn't cry out to God. It's like his stubbornness prevails. I'm not crying out to God. You can throw me in the sea, but I'm not crying out to him. But the sailors, the pagans in this story, they turn to God and they cry out to him. They become good. What kind of things do we learn from this story? One of the traps of being a religious person, one of the traps of being a Christian for a bit, one of the traps of coming to church, and it's especially true, I think, for that group of people, is that it's easy for us to think that we are better than everybody else. I think it's probably easy for everyone to have that mindset, but I think it's a real trap for religious people, Christian people, God's people. It clearly is in the Old Testament. That's one of the points of the Old Testament, that you end up just automatically assuming that you're better than anybody else. And there's a powerful satirical message for all the Hebrew people and religious people listening around the campfire. And it's like explicit in the story, I think. We're all in the same boat. Jonah never clocks it, but we're all in the same boat. Are you familiar with that expression? We're all in the same boat. It's just a simple expression, but it's an incredibly enabling perspective to have on life. If you really believe that you look around, and I think the Bible is teaching us this, that in a sense, we're all in the same boat. If you realize that your neighbor is in the same circumstance as you are, and you can say to them, oh man, they used to find them really annoying, they used to drive me mad, but now I realize they've got 3 kids like us, they're just in the same boat as us. What becomes possible are traits like patience, empathy, forgiveness. And when you start to think that you're in a better boat than everybody else, which is the easy thing to do, patience, empathy, and forgiveness are less available and for less people. It's a really clever story. Jonah was literally in the same boat as these people, and he could not see it. And it reminds us that that perspective is so easy to forget. We are all sinners, to use that language. And it's so easy to forget, and so empathy and forgiveness is so easy to lose. And yet when we remember that message, it's so empowering. The last thing that we learn from this story, or the last thing we're going to learn today, the last thing that we can fall asleep to, and it's perhaps the most poignant moment of the story. Jonah teaches us that we can fall asleep to the beautiful moments that people find salvation. Jonah fell asleep to this gorgeous moment that these sailors, these pagan people, out of nowhere, just doing their normal job, find Yahweh, find the God Almighty. It's just an incredible moment at the end of the story. And Jonah doesn't get to be there. He's sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Verse 16, he's heading deep, deep down. He's heading towards the fish. We've not got there yet. We'll get there next week. He's on his way down, and he's missing what is a glorious moment on this ship. You see how awesome this moment is on this ship? They're up on deck, and there is this miraculous calm after the storm. And there they are, these sailors, who maybe have never even heard of the God of Israel before. Maybe they have. And they find themselves there making sacrifices to him, making promises to him, finding the God. It's an incredible moment, and Jonah misses it. Jonah's on his way down to meet the fish, and he could be looking at the gorgeous horizon in the peace with them. One of the things that we do, I think, again, as religious people, and this is definitely a hit for me, I've addressed this one specifically to me, is we rule people out. Do you get that? Do you do that in your life? That's one of my big flaws. Sometimes it can take me years to rule somebody out and just to go, do you know what, I give up with this person. Sometimes I can get there pretty quick, where you just go, I'm ruling this person out. And I guess the case for the defense for that is the world is a really tough place. We've got to look after ourselves and protect ourselves. But one of the messages that God gives us, just reaffirms this over and over again from the Bible, is I keep the door wide open for as many people as I can, for as long as I can. And what this story reminds us is that when we shut that door, which we do sometimes, it's us that miss out down the line. We miss out on the glorious moments of redemption that are available with God. And the story says, just think about that. Just think about the barriers that you put up. Just think about the lines that you draw in the sand. And remember that my grace flows out really freely to anyone that would receive it. So as you listen to this story, I wonder, do you think that you are asleep or awake? Do you think our world is asleep or awake? Do you think our world's got something to learn about what it means to be awake with God? If I'm really honest, most of the time, often, definitely sometimes, I don't mind the idea, given how painful the world is, of trying to sleepwalk through it. Some days I just decide I'm just going to sleepwalk through the day. I'm just going to choose zombie today because it's too painful out there. But God says to us, the Bible says to us, can you imagine what it's like if everyone could wake up? Can you imagine what the world would be like if it was really awake? Jesus says to us, I've not come so that you can fall asleep. I've come so you can have life. I've come so that you can be waken up. I've come so that you can have life and truth. Do you know what life and truth is? I think that's what it means to be awake. When you are alive and what you're seeing is the truth and what's real. And in a sense, as people who believe in Jesus, one parts of the reality for us is that we've seen some of that. There's a sense in which the lights dawned on us for some of this stuff. We are being awakened. We are awake. God said to us, I've told you that you're in the same boat. I've enabled your empathy and your forgiveness. I've shown you the mirror. I've shown you what you're like. We are awake to what people around us really need, what we really need. We are awakened to that. We are awakened to what the real storms are in life. We're awake to that. We're awake to our place in life. We are awake to our commission. We are awake to our purpose. God says, this is what it's like to be awake. Are you awake or are you asleep? Finally, as we see Jonah sink into the waves, the story would remind us that there are some storms in life that we can't sleep through. Some of the storms in life we can't sleep through. We're going to wake up at one bit down our life throughout life's journey that we can't face. The storm's too rough. At least we can't face it on our own. this story reminds us, and it points us, perhaps, to someone who can. Somebody that will go into the storm for us and show us a way through. And we'll find a bit more about that as we go through the story.